Now, in case you weren't here when I spoke before, I'm Elizabeth Handsley. I'm the President of the Australian Council on Children in the Media, but I'm also a Professor of Law at Flinders University. And that will become relevant in a minute, but just in case you're wondering where I sit in the world, I'm not an educator. Well, I'm not an early childhood educator. I do educate people at the other end of the education spectrum, and I have a few thoughts on that too. But anyway, what I'm doing now is that I have the very great pleasure and privilege of doing a summing up for what's been going on for today, and I hope this helps you, and I hope that you'll be willing to help me come back with more ideas that were important to you or other ways of thinking about things. But I just thought I'd jot down a few ideas that have been developing in my mind over the course of the day based on what I've been hearing and seeing. I'm starting with this concept of curriculum by reminiscence, and this is where I need to sort of go back to where I work, which is in a school of law within a faculty of education, humanities and law. So though I'm not an educator myself in the relevant sense, I do have faculty colleagues who are educators, and in particular our last executive dean of the faculty was an educator, and she also happened to be a specialist in curriculum development. She came over one day to help us lawyers redo our curriculum, and she stopped at one point and said, "You know, you lawyers, you just do curriculum by reminiscence. You think about how things used to be for you when you were law students, and you just want to replicate the way that it was for you." And I thought it had some truth to it, but then I also thought, on reflecting, that's kind of how most people do things, I think. And that's what we often find when we're talking about the impact of new media on children's lives, that we think about how our lives were as children, or perhaps how our children's lives were, and then we try to sort of match that up with what's going on or not. But the way that I see it is that we're basically negotiating with history, that we're thinking about history, that we're thinking about how things were, and we're constantly, I mean, if we're really sort of in the zone where we're going to be doing something that's useful and thoughtful, we're thinking about what was good about history, what was not so good, what was important, what was not so important. So it's about hanging on to the best of what we are or what we had, and then trying to translate the rest. It's terrible not being able to see the screen while you're talking. Translating the best of what we had into the new world. And that's where the concepts of theory and practice come in. And I was thinking a lot about theory and practice, especially during Kate's session, but that sort of set the tone for a lot of the rest of what went on today, that we were thinking about the theory of child development, what we know, based on theory and research and so on, and how we can translate that into this new world where there's a lot of stuff going on that we just can't know what the actual outcomes are or what the actual effects are or influences. We just have to use the best theory that we have. And I was reminded during Kate's keynote at the beginning of the day of the expression of a feminist hero of mine, Catherine McKinnon: "There's nothing as practical as a good theory." And you could see that really coming through in Kate's talk, how she could go back to basic child development theory and then use that to think through how we can use technology in child development type activities. There are also some enduring principles that came out in a number of the talks, came out in Margaret's talk as well, and Glenn's talk, about just things that we know, maybe part of an academic theory, but maybe also part of just, what we believe in as a society about parents and adults' responsibilities towards children and so on. And those principles can be applied to useful effect in relation to the kinds of issues we've been looking at today. I think it's also important in this context to really be clear on just how new a world this is. And I think you hear a lot, not necessarily in this room today, but when you hear discussions about these sorts of issues in the broader community, you hear people talking like, just we can throw everything out because everything's changed so much. And that reminds me of what another wise woman I used to know said to me many times, who happened to be my mother, when I was around 13, 14, and I'd want to do this and want to do that, and she'd say to me, "I never would have expected to do that when I was 14." And I'd say, "But times have changed." And she said, "But people haven't." And that's really just a wonderful piece of wisdom that just keeps on being proven true over and over again as I go through life, that children haven't really changed. And I feel a bit nervous sometimes when I hear people talking like, "Oh, this current generation is completely different to anybody else." obviously they have a different experience, they have a different upbringing. The fact that they're digital natives is really important, but it's also important to put that in context and the fact that human beings haven't actually changed all that much for the last 100,000 years or so. Another really big idea that came out of today, I'm sure you'll all agree, was balance. That was what we all kept coming back to. Now, that's what I would call a motherhood concept. It's something that nobody disagrees with. Nobody is ever going to argue against balance. Now, the fact that nobody disagrees with it actually means that it raises more questions than it answers. And so it's a kind of a frustrating concept. It's lovely to be able to rally around a concept, but then when we will all have different ideas about how it actually applies in day-to-day life. Now, one idea that came up a few times in a few different presentations today that I think is really worth considering is the idea of opportunity costs. So, when we're looking at balance, we're looking at, you go in this direction, there's an opportunity cost because you don't get to do this thing over here. And we heard a couple of different ideas about what the opportunity costs might be. Like, for example, Margaret was talking about the opportunity cost in children losing the ability or losing the opportunity, should we say, to learn digital skills and techniques if they don't start early enough using technology and technological tools. Whereas Glenn talked more about the opportunity costs of other kinds of play, of outdoor play, active play and so on. So there's always going to be a concept of opportunity costs, but once again, we have different ideas about what those costs might be, and then we need to ultimately place some kind of value on them in order to weigh them in the balance and to get that balance that we're looking for. One way or another, I think we seem to all agree that active parent or adult involvement is essential in all of this. I think you probably picked that up yourselves during the course of the day, so I won't dwell on it. But I was also really struck by the anecdote that Glenn told about the teacher who took on the challenge of the Ghostbusters game and just brought so much wonderful creativity to that game. And that's where I take my hat off to early childhood educators and educators of older children as well, who, in my experience, do have a lot of creativity, and that's what makes them really good at their job and what makes a lot of you really good at your job. So well done for that, and keep on with it, because that's clearly what's needed here. The need for creativity is only becoming stronger. It'll never go away. And then ultimately the question is, what do we do when we're not sure of the correct balance? So we've got a couple of things, if I could sum up what the two directions are. One is on the side of freedom and what a lot of people would think of as progress. That is, if we engage children more and more in technological activities and technology-based activities, and that is freedom. It's progress for them, and it's also playing to the principle of freedom, which is a wonderful thing. But on the other hand, we've got the precautionary principle, which is very well established in our society and our legal system as something that comes into play where children are involved, where there is evidence of a risk of harm. We err on the side of caution. So that's the other, I suppose, the other side of the balance. And I don't know what the answers are, I honestly don't, and I'm sure none of us, if we're really thinking about this, none of us think we do know what the answer is, but I guess ultimately we all have a conversation, and today's been a really great conversation. I hope we'll all be able to keep the conversation going, take it back to our workplaces, take it back to the parents of the children that you look after if you're in that kind of business, and keep that conversation going, and that's ultimately how we reach the balance. Few buried themes I just thought I'd like to draw out. One is the whole idea of consumption, and that sort of started with Kate's presentation about avoiding games that are just about consumption or apps that are just about consumption. But it goes a bit further than that. I think it kept cropping up in the course of the day that we need to be concerned about advertising and commercialism. Advertising and commercialism when it comes to this kind of thing. We didn't really talk much about that. We didn't talk much about the actual downside of technology, because this isn't technology per se, but it's the way that technology plays out, because whenever there's a new development, you need to follow the money, and the money is in advertising and in trying to develop children as consumers, develop their consumer demands and so on. So that's something I just wanted to unearth a little bit from, it was there under the surface of a lot of what we were talking about today. It came to the surface a couple of times, but I think it's something for all of us to think a bit more about. And about the another buried theme I thought was just the diversity of children's contexts. And if you go through especially the parallel sessions, you can see a lot of that coming out. So in particular, ages and stages of children and their development, that's always implicit in any kind of conversation about these things. But it wasn't made explicit as much as I thought maybe it could have. We tended to talk about children generally when, in a context where it's obvious that someone's really talking about primary school age children, and the comment might not apply so much to preschool children and so on. There are also diversities around culture and ethnicity, so it was great to see some parallel sessions that addressed particular issues in that regard. Socioeconomic status is obviously always there. And related to that, parental agency. And so when you get to a point in a conversation like this where you're sort of saying, oh, well, it's just up to parents to do X, Y, Z, you always have to stop and think, well, not all parents have the capacity to do that. So it's lovely to think that parents could all have the conversation with their children about what they're seeing, on their screens, and how they need to think about that and so on. But not all parents have that capacity to even know what to say, let alone know how to say it. And so that's where we come back to the old adage of taking a village to raise a child, and how it's the responsibility of, in a sense, all adults who come into contact with a child to try to improve that aspect of things in that child's life, within reason, of course. Well, usually I like to start with the general and move to the specific, but I'm doing the opposite here. I'm going back to the big picture. Oh, sorry, did I? Okay, so that was the diversity of children's context point. Sorry, I need to keep turning around and looking at the screen. Okay, so now going to the big picture. Here are a few things that I thought was big picture issues that came out of today, or big picture concepts, I really should say, not necessarily issues. But something that came up a couple of times in the parallel sessions, and I think was implicit again in a lot of what was being discussed, was just this idea of the meaning of life, really. But how one can bring meaning to children's lives in a way that helps with their ultimate development. And that's the next thing I was going to say was about listening and responding to children. And there was, again, some wonderful stories and points made in the course of the presentations about how important it is to know why children do the things they do, why they want the things they want, and if those things are ultimately not going to be not going to work in the children's interests, then we need to think hard about how to balance up what the children wants from what we perceive as an adult to be in their interests. And I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you that's something that you live and breathe every day. But very important part of the big picture here, and I was really pleased to see how that came out in so many of the presentations. Ultimately, and I'll just go back. Ultimately, too obvious to be mentioned, really, that it's all about children's well-being and development. That's something that a lot of very smart people have done a lot of work on for a long time, and today has just confirmed, I think, how we can build further on that work that's been done in understanding children's needs in terms of well-being and development, and apply, as I said, the theories and the principles to new events that have worked in past events as well. But what I really hope we're all going to come away with, because I've come away with this and I'm not even one of these professionals with the evidence base. As I said, I'm a lawyer, I don't work directly with young children, but I know a lot of you do, and I know a lot of you have very good professional credentials, very good professional attitude, are committed to working off an evidence base. That evidence base is growing all of the time, and there are some very good people, as you know, working on developing that evidence base. So I think there's a lot of ground for confidence and for optimism about how one can move into the future and keep on doing the great work with children that people like you have been doing for a long time now, and just keep on adapting and keep on growing and keep on serving children's interests well.